"You're fired," he sneered, his voice echoing in the hushed opulence of the dining room. He tore the cheap leather cord from her neck, a worthless trinket he called it, and tossed it to the floor. He never imagined that the city's most powerful and reclusive man, watching from the corner table, would recognize the small brass object not as jewelry, but as the key to a 40-year-old promise and a billion-dollar legacy. For the cruel manager, it was a mistake that would cost him everything. For the young waitress, it was the moment the life she knew ended, and the one she was owed truly began. The clatter of silver on bone china was the only music Clara Maeve knew. It was the soundtrack to her aching feet, her strained smile, and the relentless, gnawing anxiety that lived in the pit of her stomach. At 21, she was a ghost in the Grand Theater of Aurelia, a Michelin-starred restaurant perched atop a skyscraper in the heart of Chicago. Aurelia was a world of shimmering glass and hushed velvet, a place where fortunes were made and lost over plates of food that cost more than her monthly rent. The patrons wore their wealth like a second skin, effortless, custom-tailored, and impenetrable. Clara wore her uniform, a starched black shell that felt more like a costume for a part she was desperate to keep. She moved with a practiced efficiency born of desperation, her tray a silver moon gliding through a constellation of crystal glasses and whispered conversations. Her focus was absolute, a survival mechanism honed over years of navigating the precarious edge of poverty. Every cleared plate, every refilled glass, was a small victory against the tide of bills threatening to pull her and her grandmother under. Her grandmother, Eleonora, was the center of her universe, and that universe was shrinking. Dementia was a cruel thief, stealing memories and leaving behind a fog of confusion and fear. Their tiny rent-controlled apartment in Pilsen was a world away from Aurelia, filled with the scent of lavender and old paper, and the faint metallic smell of the tools Eleonora no longer recognized. Before the fog rolled in, Eleonora had been a horologist, a master watchmaker. Her hands, now frail and trembling, had once coaxed life into the most intricate of mechanisms. "Every gear has a purpose, Clarabelle," she used to say, her voice a warm murmur over the tick-tock of a dozen clocks. "Nothing is random. You just have to look close enough to see the design." Clara had inherited that eye for detail, that patience for the small, interlocking pieces of the world. It was a skill that made her an exemplary waitress. She could anticipate a diner's need for water before they knew they were thirsty, spot a microscopic smudge on a wine glass from across the room. It also allowed her to keep their ancient plumbing from collapsing and the window AC unit rattling through another brutal Chicago summer. But it was a skill that went unnoticed, unvalued. At Aurelia, she was just another set of hands. And no one's hands were watched more closely than by Marcus Thorne, the restaurant's general manager. Marcus was a man carved from ice and ambition. His suits were razor-sharp, his hair slicked back with a severity that matched his personality. He patrolled the dining room like a predator, his eyes missing nothing, his tongue quick with venom. He seemed to derive a perverse pleasure from the power he wielded over his staff, finding fault in the smallest of details. A fork misaligned by a millimeter, a smile that didn't reach the eyes, a moment of hesitation. He was particularly cruel to Clara, whose quiet resilience seemed to offend him on a fundamental level. "Carter," he'd hiss, materializing at her elbow. "Table 7's water glasses are only 2/3 full. Are we rationing now? Is this a charity kitchen?" Or, "That's the 3rd time you've brushed that stray strand of hair from your face. Get it under control, or I'll find someone who can." The object of his most persistent ire was the small, unusual object she wore around her neck. It was a key, intricately carved from brass, with a complex gear-like head and a unique, fluted shaft. It hung from a simple, worn leather cord. It was the only thing she had of her grandfather, a man she'd never met, a man Eleonora's failing memory could no longer conjure. "My Arthur gave it to me," was all Eleonora could manage on her good days, her fingers tracing the key's pattern in Clara's palm. "He said it was the key to the future, a promise." Clara wore it tucked beneath her uniform, the cool metal a constant, secret comfort against her skin. But sometimes when she bent to set down a plate, it would swing free, And Marcus always saw. "I've told you about that thing," he'd said just last week, his voice a low threat. "Employee dress code is explicit. No personal jewelry besides a simple wedding band. You are not a walking pawn shop, Carter. You are a representative of Aurelia. Lose it." Clara had simply tucked it back in, her heart hammering. She couldn't lose it. It was more than a keepsake. It was the last tangible piece of her own history, a link to the man whose face she'd never seen, but whose blood ran in her veins. She needed this job, needed it like air, but the thought of taking off the key felt like a betrayal she couldn't commit. Tonight the air in Aurelia was thick with an almost electric tension. Julian Croft was dining at table 12. Even Clara, who paid little attention to the world of billionaires and tech titans, knew the name. Croft was a legend, the founder of Croft Innovations, a man who had revolutionized data storage and microprocessing decades ago and had since become a recluse. He rarely appeared in public, and his presence at Aurelia had the staff on high alert. Marcus was practically vibrating with a mix of sycophantic glee and terror. "Everything must be perfect," he drilled them in the pre-shift briefing. "Mr. Croft is not just a customer, he is an institution. Any mistake, however minor, will be grounds for immediate dismissal. Do you understand me?" Clara was assigned to the section adjacent to Croft's, but she couldn't help but steal glances at him. He was older than she'd expected, perhaps in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair and a face etched with lines that spoke not of laughter, but of immense pressure in sleepless nights. He sat alone, staring out the floor-to-ceiling window at the sprawling city lights, a glass of amber liquid untouched before him. There was an aura of profound loneliness about him, a stillness that was jarring amidst the restaurant's buzzing energy. He looked less like a captain of industry and more like a man haunted. Her own night was a blur of controlled chaos. A party of 6 had sent back their wine twice. A woman at table 9 had dropped her fork and looked at Clara as if she had personally thrown it on the floor. Through it all, Marcus was a shadow at her back, his breath on her neck. She could feel his eyes on her, waiting for a mistake. The mistake came, as it always did, from a place of kindness. An elderly gentleman at her table, Mr. Henderson, was fumbling with his reading glasses, trying to decipher the dessert menu. His hands shook with a tremor that reminded Clara so painfully of her grandmother. "Allow me, sir," she said softly, leaning in slightly to help him. As she did, the leather cord of her necklace slipped from beneath her collar. The brass key swung out, catching the light of the chandelier for a brief, brilliant second before she could tuck it away. It was long enough. Marcus was on her in an instant. He didn't speak. He simply crooked a finger, beckoning her to a small alcove near the service station. His smile was thin and predatory. "I believe my instructions were clear, Carter," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thorne. It was an accident. It won't happen again." Her voice was a plea, small and desperate. "You are correct, it won't," he replied. His eyes glittered with a cold triumph. "Because you are a liability. You lack the polish, the discipline, the basic ability to follow simple instructions. You don't belong here." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. "Please, Mr. Thorne, I need this job. My grandmother—" "I am not running a charity," he cut her off. "Your personal problems are of no interest to me. What is of interest is the integrity of this establishment, which you seem determined to undermine with your sentimental clutter." From the corner of her eye, she saw movement. Julian Croft had turned from the window. His gaze wasn't on the city anymore. It was on them. His expression was unreadable, a mask of weary indifference, but he was watching. Marcus, emboldened by the audience, seemed to swell with self-importance. "Give it to me," he demanded, holding out his hand. "What?" Clara whispered. "The necklace. The trinket. Give it to me. It's a violation of company policy. Therefore, it's company property now." Clara's hand flew to her chest, covering the spot where the key lay hidden. "No, you can't." "I can and I will." His face was turning red, his composure cracking under her defiance. "You are dismissed, Carter. Your final paycheck will be mailed to you. Now give me the necklace, or I'll have security escort you out." Tears burned behind her eyes, but she held them back. The humiliation was a physical force, pressing in on her. She could feel the stares of other diners, hear the whispers starting to ripple through the room. To be fired was one thing. To be robbed of the one thing that connected her to her past was another. "It's all I have of my grandfather," she said, her voice shaking but firm. Marcus let out a short, ugly laugh. "Your grandfather? I highly doubt this piece of junk has any value. Now hand it over." He lunged forward, his fingers hooking around the leather cord. Clara flinched back, but he was too quick. With a sharp tug, the worn leather snapped. The key fell from his grasp, clattering onto the polished marble floor with a small, forlorn sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Marcus stared down at it, then back at her, his lips curled in a sneer of victory. "Pack your locker. You have 5 minutes." He turned to walk away, a king dismissing a peasant. "Wait." The voice was not loud, but it cut through the room with an authority that stopped Marcus in his tracks. Every head turned. Julian Croft was on his feet, his chair pushed back. He walked slowly, deliberately, toward the alcove. The air crackled. He didn't look at Marcus. His eyes, a piercing, intelligent blue, were fixed on the small brass key lying on the floor. He stopped, bent down with the stiff grace of an older man, and picked it up. He held it in his palm, turning it over and over, his thumb tracing its intricate, gear-like head. The weary indifference on his face was gone, replaced by a look of stunned, almost pained recognition. A tremor ran through his hand. 40 years, he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion Clara couldn't decipher. He looked up, not at Marcus, but directly at her. His gaze was so intense it felt like it was stripping away the layers of waitress, of orphan, of survivor, and seeing something deeper. "Where?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "Did you get this key?" The silence in Aurelia was absolute. The clinking of silverware had ceased. The whispers had died. The entire glittering room seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for her answer. Clara stood frozen between the man who had just taken her future and the man who was holding her past in the palm of his hand. Marcus Thorne, momentarily forgotten, sputtered back to life. His face, which had gone pale at Croft's intervention, now flushed with a new kind of indignant rage. He saw his authority being challenged, his perfect moment of power being hijacked. "Mr. Croft, I do apologize for this disruption," Marcus began, stepping forward with an oily smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This is a simple internal staffing matter. This employee was terminated for repeated violations of our dress code and for insubordination. I can assure you—" Croft didn't even turn his head. He raised a hand, a small, dismissive gesture that silenced Marcus more effectively than a shout. His entire focus remained on Clara, his blue eyes searching hers as if looking for an answer to a question he hadn't yet asked. The key lay heavy in his palm, a small piece of brass that had somehow become the center of gravity in the room. "I asked you a question, young lady," Croft repeated, his voice softer now, but with an undercurrent of steel. "It's important, please. Tell me where you got this." Clara's mind was a whirlwind. Humiliation warred with a strange, burgeoning hope. This powerful man's reaction made no sense. It was just a key, her grandfather's key. "It was my grandfather's," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, but it carried in the unnatural quiet. "It's the only thing I have of his. My grandmother gave it to me." "Your grandfather," Croft said, the words tasting strange in his mouth. "What was his name?" Arthur Maeve." The name struck Julian Croft like a physical blow. He staggered back a half step, his hand flying to the edge of a nearby table to steady himself. The color drained from his face, leaving it a waxy ashen gray. The carefully constructed wall of weary detachment he wore crumbled, revealing a raw, profound grief that stunned the onlookers. He stared at the key in his hand, then back at Clara, and for the first time she saw not a billionaire, not a recluse, but a man drowning in a memory. "Arthur," he breathed. "Arthur's granddaughter." Marcus, unable to stand being ignored any longer, stepped forward again. "Sir, this is absurd. She's a nobody, a line cook's kid from the West Side. She's probably lying, trying to get your sympathy. I caught her trying to pocket a bottle of wine last month." "Be silent," Croft snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. He finally turned to face Marcus, and the look in his eyes was so cold, so filled with a sudden, blazing fury, that Marcus visibly recoiled. "You have no idea what you have just done. You have no idea who you are speaking to." Croft turned back to Clara, his expression softening again, though his hand still trembled. "Your grandmother, Eleonora?" Clara could only nod, her throat tight. How could this stranger know her grandmother's name? "I knew them," Croft said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "A lifetime ago. Arthur. Arthur was my partner, my friend. He was the most brilliant man I ever knew. He was the heart of Croft Innovations. I was just the salesman." He looked down at the key again. "We made this together, in his workshop. It was the key to our first major project, a prototype vault. We called it The Promise. He was so proud of it." A collective gasp rippled through the dining room. The staff, frozen along the walls, exchanged wide-eyed glances. This wasn't just a drama. This was a piece of corporate history unfolding in their service alley. "That's impossible," Marcus blurted out, his face a mask of disbelief and panic. "Arthur Mave died in a workshop fire 40 years ago. It was all over the papers. He had no family." "The papers were wrong," Croft said, his gaze locked on Clara. "He had Eleonora, and he had a daughter. They left town after the fire. I tried to find them. For years I tried. But they disappeared. I thought—" His voice broke. "I thought they were gone." He took a step closer to Clara, his eyes tracing the lines of her face. "You have his eyes," he said softly. "That same intensity, that same focus." He finally seemed to see her, not as a waitress, but as a person, a legacy. "He would be so proud of you." Clara felt the tears she had held back finally spill over, hot tracks of disbelief and overwhelming emotion. All her life she had been a ghost, a girl with no history, no foundation. And now this man was giving her a past, a connection that felt more real than anything she had ever known. But Marcus Thorne was not a man to accept defeat. His world was crumbling. The insignificant waitress he had tormented for months was now the center of attention, the heir to a story connected to the most powerful man in the room. His mind raced, searching for a way to regain control, to discredit her, to save himself. "It's a trick," he suddenly shouted, his voice shrill. "She must have found out you were coming here tonight. She researched you, found this story, bought a key from a junk shop. She's a con artist. Security." He waved frantically towards the entrance. "Get her out of here." Two burly men in black suits started to move forward, their expressions impassive. "Stop!" Croft commanded, his voice ringing with absolute authority. The security guards froze, looking uncertainly between their manager and the billionaire. Croft looked at Marcus with an expression of pure disgust. Then he turned his gaze back to Clara, a thoughtful, almost calculating look entering his eyes. He wasn't just sentimental. He was a scientist, an inventor. He needed proof. "He's right about one thing," Croft said calmly, his voice steadying. "Assertions require evidence." He held the key up between his thumb and forefinger. "This isn't just a key, Miss Maeve. Arthur and I built a failsafe into it. A puzzle. Something only someone with his mind, or someone taught by him, could possibly know." He held it out to her. "Look closely. Tell me what you see." Clara took the key, her fingers trembling. It felt different now, heavier with the weight of its own history. She held it to the light, her mind quieting, her focus narrowing. The waitress fell away, and for a moment, she was a little girl again in her grandmother's workshop, the scent of oil and old brass in the air. "Look close enough to see the design, Clarabelle." The head of the key was a series of interlocking gears. It looked like a solid piece of brass. But Clara's eye, trained by years of watching Eleonora work on impossibly tiny watch movements, saw something else. A line, almost invisible to the naked eye, on the circumference of the largest gear. A seam. And on the shaft, just below the head, a series of tiny, almost microscopic scratches. They looked random, but they weren't. They were a pattern. "The gears," she said, her voice gaining confidence. "They turn. You have to press the third tooth on the outer gear while rotating the central one counterclockwise. It should disengage the lock." She paused, her finger tracing the scratches on the shaft. And these markings, they're not scratches. They're a sequence, a combination. My grandmother taught me the basics of horological notation. It looks like a date. She squinted. October 27th. Julian Croft's face went slack with shock. He took the key from her, and with a dexterity that belied his age, he followed her instructions. There was a faint, almost inaudible click. The gears on the key's head shifted, rearranging themselves into a new configuration. A tiny hollow compartment was revealed inside. October 27th, Croft whispered, his eyes wide. My birthday. Arthur. You magnificent bastard. He looked at Clara, and all skepticism was gone, replaced by a look of sheer wonder. No one could have known that. No one. He turned to Marcus, whose face was now the color of old parchment. You, Croft said, his voice dangerously low, accused this young woman of being a liar and a thief. You assaulted her and tried to steal a priceless piece of personal history. You did this in front of my eyes. Do you have any idea of the mistake you have just made? Marcus opened and closed his mouth like a fish, but no sound came out. I am on the board of the hospitality group that owns this restaurant, Croft continued, his voice as cold and sharp as broken glass. And as of about 5 minutes ago, when I texted my broker, I am in the process of becoming its majority shareholder. My first act as the new power in this company will be to request a full, independent audit of your tenure here, Mr. Thorne. We're going to look at payroll, at the tip pooling accounts, at every vendor contract you've ever signed, and then we're going to have a very long conversation with the district attorney's office. He gestured to the frozen security guards. Please escort Mr. Thorne from the premises. He is not to touch anything in his office. His employment is terminated, effective immediately. Marcus Thorne, the petty tyrant of Aurelia, looked as if he had been struck by lightning. He stared at Clara, his eyes filled with a venomous, uncomprehending hatred, before the guards took him by the arms and led him away, his protest dissolving into pathetic whimpers. The room remained silent for a long moment. Julian Croft turned back to Clara, the key still in his hand. He looked around at the opulent dining room, at the gawking patrons, and then back at her, standing small and shaken in her simple black uniform. This is no place for this conversation, he said gently. He placed a hand lightly on her arm. Come with me, Miss Maeve, Clara. We have 40 years to catch up on. The transition from the glaring lights of Aurelia to the hushed leather interior of Julian Croft's town car was dizzying. One moment, Clara was a fired waitress standing in a puddle of humiliation. The next, she was gliding silently through the streets of Chicago, seated across from a man who was a phantom from a history she never knew she had. The city lights smeared past the tinted windows, a river of gold and neon that felt a world away from the quiet desperation of her apartment. Croft didn't speak for a long time. He simply stared at the reconfigured key in his hand, his expression a turbulent sea of emotions. Finally, he looked up at her, his eyes holding a deep, resonant sadness. I failed him, he said, his voice raspy. Arthur, after the fire, the official report said it was an accident, faulty wiring in the workshop. I never believed it. Arthur was meticulous. He would never have allowed a fire hazard. But I had no proof, just a gut feeling. And the company, it was just starting to take off. The investors were nervous. I let them convince me to accept the official story. I let them convince me to move on. He sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of decades. I tried to find Eleanor and your mother. I hired private investigators. But they had vanished. Eleanor, she was fiercely protective. I think she blamed me, and perhaps she was right. She must have wanted a clean break to protect her daughter from the world that had taken her husband. My mother, Clara said, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. She died when I was very young. A fever. I barely remember her. It's just been me and my grandmother since then. A fresh wave of pain washed over Croft's face. I'm so sorry. I should have tried harder. I should have done more. He leaned forward, his intensity palpable. Clara, what I am about to tell you will change your life. Arthur didn't just leave you that key as a memento. The promise wasn't just a prototype vault. It was his legacy. He was working on something revolutionary, a data compression algorithm that was light years ahead of its time. He believed it would change the world. Croft Innovations, everything I've built. It was founded on the pale shadow of his real genius. He kept his most important work, his theoretical papers, in that vault. He held up the key. This key, along with a biometric scan only he could provide, was supposed to open it. After his death, the vault was presumed destroyed in the fire. The company wrote it off, but the key's existence proves it survived. Clara's head was spinning. Algorithms, vaults, legacies. It was too much to process. So, my grandfather's work is still in there? I believe so, Croft said. And more than that. Before he died, we signed a partnership agreement on a cocktail napkin in a bar. It was our first official act. 50-50 partners in everything. I still have it. If we can recover his work, then by right, half of everything that came from it belongs to his legal heir. The car fell silent. The implication of his words hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. Half of Croft Innovations. The number was so vast, so astronomical, that her mind couldn't even begin to grasp it. It was like trying to imagine the edge of the universe. I don't know what to say, she stammered. You don't have to say anything yet, Croft said kindly. First, we need to find the vault. It was housed in our original R&D building, a warehouse in the Fulton River district. It's been abandoned for decades, but my company still owns the property. He turned to his driver. Change of destination, Robert. Take us to the old Fulton warehouse. The warehouse was a skeletal giant looming in the darkness, its windows like vacant eyes. The air inside was cold and smelled of dust, decay, and forgotten time. Armed with powerful flashlights, they navigated through cavernous. The air that bled from the vault was not the stale, dusty breath of a tomb, but something cleaner, colder, and impossibly ancient. It smelled of machine oil, ozone, and the profound stillness of time held captive. Julian Croft moved as if in a trance, his flashlight beam cutting a trembling path through the darkness. The vault was a perfect cube of obsidian steel, a scar of defiant geometry in the sub-basement's decay, miraculously untouched by the inferno that had claimed the world above. Its surface, though layered with the soot of 4 decades, was unblemished. On its face was a single elegant keyhole and a small dark glass plate for the biometric scan. This is it, Croft breathed, the words turning to plumes of mist in the frigid air. The promise. He ran a gloved hand over the cold steel, a gesture of both reverence and frustration. But the biometric scanner, it was keyed to Arthur's handprint, his unique vascular patterns, the whorls of his fingerprints. Without him, it's just a box. Clara stepped forward, her own small flashlight beam dancing across the vault door. The world outside, Aurelia, Marcus Thorne, the life of aching feet and feigned smiles, had dissolved into a surreal dream. This felt real. The cold, the silence, the immense weight of the object before her. This felt like truth. She looked at the dark glass plate, a blind eye staring out from the past. Then she looked at her own hands, slender and calloused from work, but undeniably her own. They were not her grandfather's hands, but her mind. Her mind was a legacy. Every gear has a purpose, Clarabelle. Nothing is random. You just have to look close enough to see the design. Her grandmother's voice echoed in the cavern of her memory, clearer than it had been in years. Eleonora had taught her to see the world as a grand, intricate mechanism, to look for the seams, the hidden levers, the deliberate imperfections that betrayed the maker's true intent. My grandfather was a watchmaker at heart, wasn't he? She asked softly, her voice absorbing the oppressive silence. A horologist, like my grandmother. The best there ever was, Croft affirmed, his tone laced with a grief that was still raw. He saw the universe in the turn of a gear. Then he wouldn't have built a lock with a single point of failure, Clara stated, not as a question, but as a declaration of faith. Her fingers, sensitive from years of polishing silverware to a flawless sheen, began to trace the perimeter of the biometric scanner. The steel was smooth, seamless, but it wasn't. Her pads registered a faint discrepancy, a line finer than a human hair, at the 4 o'clock position of the circular plate. It wasn't a flaw. It was a door. He would have built a bypass, she whispered, her heart beginning to hammer a frantic rhythm against her ribs. A secret, a mechanical override, for the one person he trusted to understand his language. She pressed her thumb firmly onto the invisible seam. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sigh of pressurized air, a tiny section of the steel faceplate retracted. Not with a vulgar clunk, but with the silent, oiled precision of a timepiece's complication. It revealed a secondary keyhole, smaller than the first, cut into the shape of a perfect, five-pointed star. Julian Croft let out a strangled gasp. He stared at the star, then at the reconfigured key in his hand, its gears now locked into that very same celestial shape. "My God," he whispered. "I worked with him for years. I watched him build this thing. I never knew." "It wasn't for you," Clara said, a sad, knowing smile touching her lips for the first time that night. "It was for her, for my grandmother. It was their secret language." With a hand that trembled not from age but from the electric shock of discovery, Julian inserted the star-shaped key. It slid home with a whisper of metal on metal. He turned it. A deep, resonant thud vibrated from within the vault, the sound of colossal deadbolts retracting like waking titans. He then inserted the key's original fluted shaft into the main lock and turned it once more. A final sonorous clunk echoed through the sub-basement, and the immense door, balanced on perfectly engineered hinges, swung inward on a breath of preserved air. The interior was a sanctuary. No dust, no decay. The air hummed with a faint energy from what must have been a fantastically long-lasting power source. In the center of the small, sterile room, resting upon a simple steel pedestal, was a stack of leather-bound journals and a handsome, unadorned box of dark cherrywood. Croft approached the journals as if approaching an altar. He lifted the top volume, its leather supple and cool. He opened it, and the pages were dense with a script that was both elegant and severe, interspersed with mathematical equations and engineering schematics of breathtaking complexity. The numbers swam before Clara's eyes, a language of ghosts. But the diagrams sang to her. She could see the logic, the flow, the genius in the architecture of the ideas. "It's all here," Croft breathed, his voice cracking. "The data compression, the foundational principles for neural networking." Clara, he was thinking about artificial intelligence in the 1980s. He wasn't just ahead of his time, he was in another time altogether. This is the true genesis of the digital age. Clara, however, found herself drawn to the cherrywood box. It felt more personal, more human. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded royal blue velvet, was not more data, but art. A collection of half a dozen timepieces, each one a unique masterpiece. Pocket watches with celestial charts that track the moon's phases. Wristwatches with tourbillon cages that spun like captured galaxies. They were her grandfather's soul, rendered in brass and steel and jewels, and beneath them, a thick, cream-colored envelope, sealed with wax, bearing a single word, Eleonora. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal. The paper within was heavy, fibrous, and covered in that same precise, elegant script. And beneath the letter, a thick sheaf of documents, stock certificates, original founding shares for a company called AJ Dynamics, the precursor to Croft Innovations. "My dearest Eleonora," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means the worst has happened, and my key has found its way home to the hand of its intended keeper. Do not grieve for me, my love. My time with you and our sweet girl has been a life complete. This box contains my heart's work, not the cold logic of the journals, but the craft, the art, that you and I shared. It is all I have of value. Sell them or keep them, but know that in every tick you will hear my love for you. The stocks are a more practical matter. They are for the future, to ensure you and our child will never want for anything. Julian is a good man, a brilliant salesman, but he is too trusting. He cannot see the vipers for the grass. Tell him for me. Tell him to be wary of snakes in his own garden. Not all accidents are accidental. Some are simply designs with a more malicious purpose. The final sentences landed like stones in the pit of Clara's stomach. The cold in the room was no longer just physical. It was the chilling dread of a 40-year-old warning finally being heard. "Snakes in his own garden," she read aloud, her voice a fragile whisper in the vast, silent chamber. Croft looked up from a journal, his face a mask of grim understanding. He had been so lost in the rediscovery of Arthur's genius that he had forgotten the tragedy of his end. "He knew," Croft said, his voice flat and hard. "He suspected someone, that the fire wasn't an accident." He slowly closed the journal, the reverence replaced by a cold, simmering fury. He looked at Clara, at the letter in her hand, at the vast, empty space where a life should have been. This changes everything. This is no longer about reclaiming a legacy, it is about avenging one. The ensuing weeks were a baptism by fire and paper. Clara's life bifurcated into two violently contrasting realities. In one, she was by her grandmother's side in a sun-drenched suite at the finest memory care facility in Illinois, a place of quiet gardens and gentle, understanding staff. Julian had arranged it all with a single phone call. In her lucid moments, Eleonora would cradle one of Arthur's watches, her frail fingers tracing the engravings on the case, a flicker of profound recognition in her clouded eyes. "Arthur's hands," she would murmur, a ghost of a smile on her lips. He had such clever hands. Those moments were both a blessing and a torment, a window into a past Clara could only glimpse, never fully enter. In her other reality, she was submerged in the shark-infested waters of corporate law. Julian didn't shield her. He insisted she be present for every meeting, every deposition, every strategic session with the phalanx of lawyers he'd assembled. He didn't treat her as a fragile heiress. He treated her as the surrogate for his lost partner. He explained shareholder dilution, fiduciary duty, and hostile takeovers with the same patience he might have used to explain a schematic. He was handing her the keys to a kingdom she never knew existed, and the weight of them felt heavier than the vault door. Imposter syndrome was a constant, suffocating presence. She sat at mahogany tables longer than her childhood apartment, surrounded by men in bespoke suits who spoke a dialect of finance and litigation she barely understood. They saw a waitress in borrowed clothes, but Julian saw something else. He saw Arthur's eyes, Arthur's focus, and slowly Clara began to see it too. The legal claim to her inheritance was, as the lead attorney called it, a legal slam dunk. The cocktail napkin partnership agreement, the authenticated stock certificates, the undeniable proof in the journals that Arthur's work was the bedrock upon which Croft Innovations was built. The board had no choice but to concede. In a private settlement that avoided a public spectacle, 50% of the company's controlling shares were transferred into a trust in her name. The news, when it was finally filed, sent a tremor through the financial world. An unknown heiress, a ghost from the past, was now one of the most powerful figures in technology. But justice for Arthur Maeve was a far more elusive quarry. Croft's investigators hit a wall of time. Records were lost, memories had faded, witnesses were dead. The snake had covered its tracks over 40 years. The investigation stalled, mired in the cold, dusty archives of the past. It was Clara who found the path forward. While the investigators hunted for external clues, she retreated into the journals. She wasn't a mathematician, but she was a horologist's apprentice. She understood patterns, systems, and secret languages. Her grandmother had taught her a specific shorthand, a series of tiny symbols and notations used by master watchmakers to make notes on complex schematics. It was a language of precision. In the margins of the journals, next to equations that would redefine computing, she began to see them. Tiny, almost invisible symbols, disguised as stray marks or ink blots. A crescent moon, a small gear, a star. They weren't random. They formed a pattern. Cross-referencing them with Arthur's calendar entries from that final year, she realized they corresponded to meetings. One name was consistently marked with the symbol for a snake, a tiny, elegant sine wave, Leonard Pierce. Leonard Pierce was a titan, one of the company's founding engineers, now a revered elder statesman on the board of directors. He had always been publicly deferential to Arthur's memory, championing a scholarship in his name. Pierce, Croft had said, his face a storm of disbelief and dawning horror. Leonard. He was Arthur's most vocal mourner. He pushed the board to create a benevolent fund for the family we could never find. A snake hides best when it sheds a sympathetic skin, Clara had replied, her voice quiet but firm. The investigators now had a target. They dug into Pierce's life with surgical precision. They found the unexplained cash deposits traced to the sale of bearer bonds a month after the fire. They found a retired security guard who, when faced with old logs and a substantial check from Croft, suddenly remembered Pierce leaving the R&D warehouse on the night of the fire, reeking of what he'd thought at the time was cleaning solvent. The final damning piece came from Clara, from the last page of the last journal. It was a single sentence written in the horological shorthand. It took her a week to decipher the intricate symbols. LP resonant timer unstable. Casing breach at Frecker inevitable. Spark. It wasn't a threat. It was an engineering note. Leonard Pierce had been developing a new industrial timing device. Arthur had reviewed the schematics and found a fatal flaw. A flaw that, under specific operational frequencies, would cause a catastrophic spark. It wasn't arson. It was murder by engineered negligence. Pierce had known his prototype was a bomb waiting to go off, and he had left it in the workshop, knowing Arthur would be working late, running diagnostics that would inevitably hit that fatal frequency. He hadn't set the fire. He had simply designed the match, struck it, and walked away. The emergency board meeting was convened in the top-floor observatory of the Croft Tower, a room of glass and steel that seemed to float above the city. Leonard Pierce, a stooped, elegant man with watery eyes and a benevolent smile, greeted Clara with practiced sympathy. "My dear girl," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone, "to have you with us, Arthur's living legacy, it is a miracle." Clara met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Pierce." Croft was merciless. He didn't present an accusation. He presented a narrative. The forensic accounting, the security guard's sworn affidavit, the bank records. Pierce's face, a carefully maintained mask of grandfatherly charm, began to crack, the color draining away to reveal the pallor of old parchment. He blustered. He denied. He accused Croft of a vendetta, of trying to consolidate power. "This is preposterous," he boomed, trying to command the room. "Julian, you're using this poor, impressionable girl to settle old scores. This is character assassination of the highest order." The other board members shifted uncomfortably, their loyalties torn between the company's fiery founder and its placid elder. Then Clara spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the tension with the clarity of a bell. She didn't present evidence. She told a story. She spoke of her grandmother's hands, of the secret language of watchmakers, of the love and trust encoded in a hidden lock. Then she projected the final page of the journal onto the massive screen behind her, along with her painstaking translation. Spark. She looked directly at Leonard Pierce. "You didn't just kill my grandfather, Mr. Pierce. You used his own discipline, his own dedication to his work, as your weapon. You knew he wouldn't leave a problem unsolved. You knew he would stay. You didn't just burn his workshop. You burned his life, his family, and 40 years of the future, all to get out from under the shadow of a better man." Silence. Pierce stared at the screen, at the elegant, damning script. He didn't see a formula. He saw a ghost. The carefully constructed edifice of his life, built over 4 decades of lies and stolen credit, crumbled to dust in that single, silent moment. He didn't confess in a torrent. He simply sagged in his chair, a hollowed-out man, and whispered, "He was always so much better than me." Justice, 40 years delayed, was a quiet, clinical affair of indictments and depositions, a slow-moving gear finally locking into place. 6 months later, Clara stood on the terrace of her apartment. It wasn't a sterile penthouse in the Croft Tower, but a warm, book-filled residence in a historic building overlooking Lincoln Park. The city glittered before her, a circuit board of light and life. The memory of watching that same city from the windows of Aurelia, a servant in a world of kings, felt like a story she had read about someone else. She was no longer that person. She was a student at the University of Chicago, wrestling with thermodynamics and corporate ethics. She was a board member at Croft Innovations, where her voice, quiet but informed by a deep understanding of her grandfather's foundational principles, was beginning to command a startling degree of respect. She had used the proceeds from the sale of Arthur's watches to establish the Mave Horological Institute, a place dedicated to preserving the art of mechanical timekeeping, and had simultaneously endowed the Eleanora Mave Center for Cognitive Research at the university, funding the very science that might one day defeat the disease that held her grandmother captive. Julian had become her anchor, her mentor, the grandfather she had never known. Their relationship was forged in the fire of the investigation, a bond of shared loss and shared purpose. In securing her future, he had atoned for his past, trading the solitude of a billionaire for the messy, vibrant life of a family he had thought long dead. The brass key still hung around her neck, now on a simple, elegant platinum chain. It was no longer a secret, a link to a forgotten past. It was a statement. It was the key to a vault, to a fortune, to a terrible truth. But it was more than that. It had unlocked her. It had revealed that her life was not a series of random, unfortunate events. It was a complex, silent mechanism, waiting. Her poverty, her resilience, her meticulous eye, her grandmother's lessons, they were not accidents. They were gears, perfectly machined and assembled, waiting for the final piece to be inserted so the whole contraption could spring to life. The design had been there all along. She just needed the key to learn how to read it.